Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? It seems like an easy question to answer, but a recent online debate set the internet ablaze with arguments offered for both sides of this question. Now, the official Roman Catholic position is yes, they do. And the defenders of that proposition offer some sophisticated philosophical reasoning as to why this is so. However, I think they're wrong because every argument I've seen misses one crucial point. Hi all, I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this Come Let Us Reason Together, I wanted to tackle what has attracted quite a bit of attention recently. It seems outlandish, perhaps, that the God Muslims describe can be considered the same as the Christian God, with so many great differences between the two. Well, perhaps the debate is aiming at the wrong target. Here, I will go through the background to the controversy, I'll look at what others have argued, and then I will offer my argument why one can definitively say the claim that Christians and Muslims worship the same God is a false statement. Now that's coming up on this. Come let us reason together. Well, welcome everyone. Again, I'm glad that you've joined me today. Doing something a little different. Normally, I have either a teaching that I've given to an audience or something that I've done with a conversation. But today it's going to be a little different as this issue has truly exploded across the internet. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? The answer actually isn't quite as easy as you may believe. There's lots of pieces to this puzzle, and as a recent online debate showed on Cameron Bartuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity, where two Roman Catholic professors faced off against two others, one Orthodox and one Protestant, arguing the debate and the aspects of this question. It's quite an issue that actually goes into some deep philosophical concepts that aren't necessarily as easily brushed off as we may believe. However, in all of this debate, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of heat that's being generated, not necessarily a lot of clarification given on what the whole idea of worshiping the same God entails. And I think that's a big part of the problem in this debate. Now, in talking with several scholars about this idea, one of the things that struck me and them was simply how the question being phrased in this way can also be kind of misleading in and of its own right. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? The word same, what do you mean by same God? How does that apply? It feels like it may not even be the right structure for the argument. But we need to take it on its merits because as it is offered in online chats, on channels, even in papers of theology, we have to be able to engage in those areas where this question is being proffered. So let's talk about it a little bit. Now, the question itself actually has been around quite a while. It's not something new. If you remember, about 10 years ago at Wheaton College, there was a controversy coming up around Christmas time. Now, Wheaton College, of course, is an evangelical institution. It's one of the more conservative schools of evangelicalism. And on December 10th, one of the professors there, Professor Larissa Hawkins, decided to wear a headscarf during the Advent season. And she said she wore it as a gesture of solidarity with Muslims. Now, Hawkins, in wearing this headscarf, made this following statement. She said, quote, "I stand in religious solidarity with Muslims because they, like me, a Christian, are people of the book. And as Pope Francis stated last week, we worship the same God." Of course, this was, again, 10 years ago when Pope Francis was still alive. She goes on to say, "As part of my Advent worship, I will wear the hijab to work at Wheaton College, to play in Chi-Town, in the airport, and on the airplane to my home state that initiated one of the first anti-Sharia laws, which she considered unconstitutional and Islamophobic. and at church. This was her statement. So she is pulling from the Roman Catholic concept that Muslims and Christians are both worshiping the same God. Wheaton College, of course, received quite a bit of response to her statement, and they responded by putting the political science professor on a paid administrative leave. Now, the college said at that point that they needed more time to review whether her statement puts her at odds with the faith perspective required for professors who were to teach at Wheaton. They all have to sign a statement of faith. So there's a tension even here where she says, I am trying to support those I feel are being maligned because we worship the same God. That was 10 years ago. But it's not even that far back. When she says people of the book, we can go all the way back to the Quran itself. In fact, the Quran claims that it is talking about the same God of the Christians and the Jews. Surah 29:46, we read in the Quran, it says, quote, "Do not argue with the people of the book." Now, the people of the book mean Jews and Christians. Of course, Muhammad, for those of you that don't know, he starts his ascendancy in about 632 or so, writing aspects of the Quran being revealed to him, as they say. And over the next, several years, after being conquering in Mecca and Medina, and I won't go into the whole battles and all that, he puts forth this idea that we are the same as the Christians and the Jews. They've just got it wrong. They missed or corrupted God's message, but they are the people of the book, and they had some sense of revelation revealed to them ahead of time. So this is what Muhammad believes. This is again about 600 years after Christ, and he writes in Surah 29:46, "Do not argue with the people of the book unless gracefully, except with those of them who act wrongfully, and say, we believe in what has been revealed to us and what has been revealed to you. Our God and your God is only one, and to him we fully submit." Now that's a quotation of Surah 29:46 from Dr. Mustafa Khattab. And again, notice the claim. The claim is that it's the same God. So the Muslims are claiming the same God, even in the book of the Quran. Muhammad claims to be following the God that was revealed to Abraham, because both the Islamic faith and the Jewish faith, and thus Christianity, can trace their lineage back to Abraham. From Abraham it differs. The Muslim would say that God chose Ishmael and not Isaac, and it was actually Ishmael that was offered on the rock, and that basically the Christians have gotten this whole thing wrong with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that's where they go sideways. But they would claim that, say, Jesus was a prophet, Noah was a prophet, Adam was a prophet. They were all trying to reveal the Holy Quran in some way, shape, or form. They would also claim that Muhammad was the greatest prophet, the last prophet, because he had the Holy Quran revealed to him in its purity and in its totality. And that's what makes him supersede all of the other prophets. That's the Muslim understanding. And because of this point, then what happens is we start getting a mix-up as to what we mean when we start talking about God and who it is that we worship. The Roman Catholic view was, and it was argued, it wasn't necessarily solidified very early on. It had been argued back and forth for many, many years. Not until Vatican II comes out do they make a definitive claim on the statement. In Lumen Gentium, which was issued November 21st, 1964, here's what they write. They say, "But the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator in the first place, among whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day." Now, it is true that Muslims use language like that. Merciful, God, Allah is merciful, Allah is the judge, Allah will judge all on the last day. These are aspects of God that Muslims hold to. So Vatican II, they're claiming in this position that that is the same God as the Roman Catholic God, as the Christian God. Also, a little bit later, the next year, in Nostra Aetate 3, November 28, 1965, they write, quote, "The Church has also high regard for Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth." And they go on to say, "The God who has spoken to men, they strive to submit themselves without reserve to the hidden decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims eagerly link to their own." And this is where the debate begins, because if you're a faithful Catholic, of course you need to uphold Vatican II. This is official church dogma, right? This is what the church holds. This is what the church believes. So when Cameron Bertuzzi, who has become Roman Catholic, holds this debate, he basically brings folks on from the Roman Catholic view, from the Protestant view, and then there was a gentleman from the Eastern Orthodox view, one father there, who was very interesting as well. But they begin to engage this debate, and they begin to engage the debate using long-standing philosophical arguments. How do we know that God is the same God as the Christians are referencing? How can we tell? They just don't seem the same, right? They seem to be vastly different. You have the absolute monism of Islam, that God is a wholly other. You can't compare God to humanity. To do so would be the sin of shirk, for example. You have the triune God of Christianity. You have Jesus who becomes man. However, in Surah 112, it clearly states that God does not beget, nor is he begotten. And to do so, to make such a claim, would mean that you are committing the sin of shirk. And in Islam, that's considered the most heinous sin, the highest sin. So you have these tension points that most Protestants would respond and say, look, the God of Islam is capricious. The God of Islam is, he can be nasty. The values that he exposes, the commands that he offers, he can change his mind. He does all of these things that don't make sense. It doesn't make sense to say that we worship the same God. I also think that there's a little bit of pushback in the sense that what we're looking at is a value statement about how Islam in general is practiced. Those people who hold to God as being, full of truth, full of beauty, a God of grace. How can those kinds of things be true of the God of Christianity, while the Islamic God seems one that elevates war, that elevates ideas of suffering, that would subjugate others in total control? The whole thing just has a tension point to it that just doesn't sit well with most Protestants. And of course, it leads to other questions as well. Well, wait a minute. If Muslims and Christians worship the same God, then where does that put, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses? Aren't they worshiping the same God as well? Does that even make sense? And this is where some scholars go off and say, the problem really is phrasing it in this way, do they worship the same God, doesn't really tell you anything. Even if they're worshiping the same God, is that question of any value? And we'll get back to that. I think that's a proper question. But when we look at those who are making arguments for this, what they generally tend to point to is an idea of separating the idea of reference versus sense. Now, this goes into what we call semantic arguments about language and philosophy of language, how these are work in our society. So let me give you an example. And this point was made initially by Gottlob Frege in 1852. But when he starts talking about these ideas of points of reference, he can say you can make a reference to the same object as somebody else, even if aspects of your reference, ideas that you hold about your reference, if you have some sense of that reference, that's incorrect. If I want to talk about my Uncle Bob and I describe him to you, okay, or somebody else, maybe my mother, and I say, hey, have you ever met my mother? And somebody says, yeah, well, can you describe her to me? And you give, 3 or 4 points of reference. Well, she's about 5'8", she's, 65 years old, whatever the case may be, silver haired, 210 pounds, that kind of thing. And she gave birth to you. That's your mother. And I would say, well, no, some of those things are wrong. You're not describing my mother. But if you're talking about the person who gave birth to me, even though those other points may be wrong, you're still referencing my mother, right? The reference is the term to which the object points. When I say mother, I mean the person who gave birth to me. So when you say your mother, you're referencing the same person. The sense are kind of some of these attributes that you try to position, well, maybe she was that way 10 years ago, she's not that way now. Or maybe you're just misremembering some of those aspects. Because you're misremembering some of those aspects doesn't mean that you're not talking about my mother. The classic example on all this, matter of fact, and it's very, very timely given what's happening in our movies today, is Clark Kent versus Superman. So if you think about Lois Lane in the comics, and this is back in the comics when she didn't know Superman's secret identity, she would have an assumption that, oh, I know Clark Kent. And she would say, he's a weakling, he's, a little bit cowardly, he's fumbling, he's clumsy. This is who Clark Kent is. She would also say, I know Superman. Superman's brave and strong and able to save people and all of these great attributes. She's referring to the same person, even though she's using 2 different sets of attributes. So one person may be referring to Superman, another person may be referring to Clark Kent, but they're still talking about the same individual because Superman and Clark Kent are the same individual. Clark Kent may be a persona, and he may not truly be all of those things. He would actually have the attributes of Superman, but he hides those Superman-type attributes for the sake of his secret identity. So those who believe that this being is truly clumsy, is truly a weakling, is truly not brave, is truly a person who was born in Kansas, they would be wrong because Kal-El was never born in Kansas. But they would still be referring to the same person. So there is a point of reference and then there's a point of sense. The idea that there is a sense aspects of this person that can be right and can be wrong, but you're still talking about the same guy. And this is the crux on which the Roman Catholic argument turns. This is the pivot point here. Because Muslims hold to Allah as the God of Abraham, the only God, the creator of all things, there's only one of those. And what the Muslim would say is, and again, I read it in Surah 29, that's the God we're talking about, the same God that the Jews talk about, the creator of all things, the same God that Christianity talks about. It's replete in the Bible. Matter of fact, when God wants to talk about himself, many times he points to his creative acts, his acts of creating the universe over and over again. In the Psalms, he will talk about that. He will talk about that to Job. Where were you when I, created the heavens and all of these things. So he defines himself through his creation. And because of this, what the Roman Catholic position is, and what these professors tend to do, is they tend to diminish other aspects of God's essence to these sense type perceptions. So being a triune being, they just don't know that he's triune. They hold to him as one. Being able to take on human flesh, these kinds of things. These are just mistakes. I can be mistaken about a person's mother, but still be referring to them as your mother. If I say you should love your mother and see her at Mother's Day, even if I'm wrong about her hair, her weight, her height, all of those things, whether she's kind or unkind, I'm still saying you should see your mother at Mother's Day. So this is the Roman Catholic view. This is the Roman Catholic position, that these references to Allah point to the same being as the Christian God. And in most of these debates, this is the point that is argued. This seems to be the area that people start to fall short on. They go back and forth and back and forth. So how do we understand this kind of thing? What do we do in understanding it? Well, let's look at couple of the arguments from the Bertuzzi debate. I'm going to use Dr. Trent Dowry's arguments. He offered two of them. And the reason why I'm using these is because they're pretty straightforward. They're laid out in a syllogism, and it's really easy to kind of follow these things. And so we can just do this appropriately. So let's take a look right here. It says, first and foremost, premise number one, he says, if the Quran originated in the context of furthering the biblical narrative, then its terms pick up their references from the biblical narrative. So in other words, he's saying, look, if the Quran is borrowing ideas from the Christians and the Jews, if Muhammad didn't have this monotheism just hit him out of the blue, and it's clear that he didn't, when you read the Quran, over and over again, it does reference aspects of stories in the Bible. It doesn't do it well. So we have to be clear about that. It recognizes Moses. Like I said, it recognizes Abraham offered his son as a test of faith, but it believes that it's Ishmael, not Isaac. So the Quran talks about a kind of God's holy trinity, which they understand is the holy family of God the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Again, there's a lot of confusion there. In Muhammad's day, there was a fairly strong contingent of Jewish people living in Medina, about 800 folks, several wealthy families that he eventually actually captured and during the Battle of the Trench and overthrew and slaughtered anybody over 13, which kicks off the very big tension between the Muslims and the Jews to this day. So there was a fairly well-established Jewish contingent, of which he could pick up quite a bit, I guess, of Jewish theology. Christianity hadn't quite penetrated as deeply into that area. There were Christians there were Christian writings, but there was also certain Gnostic writings that happened to exist as well. But it wasn't as clearly defined theologically. There wasn't a good, strong theology in Saudi Arabia, what was Saudi Arabia now, back at that day, but Mecca and Medina didn't have as strong a Christian contingent. So he gets some things wrong. He gets things fuzzy. But he talks about the days of creation and things like that. So he's obviously picking up these ideas from the Bible. And Dougherty's argument is, if the Quran originated in the context of furthering the biblical narrative, extending it or changing it or correcting it, quote unquote, then its terms pick up the referenced beings from the biblical narrative. If he's trying to say this is what God really did, or this is who God really is, then the God he's talking about is the same God as the God of the Bible, because he's talking about the biblical accounts. That's his premise one. Premise two is the Quran originated in the context of furthering the biblical narrative. He's saying, historically, we just know that this is true. Therefore, the referent of God in the Quran is the biblical God. So this is his semantic argument. This is what Doherty's arguing. He offers another argument saying that Islam and Christianity, this is called the disagreement argument. He labels it thus. He says, premise one, Islam and Christianity disagree only if they are referring to the same entities. In other words, if I'm saying, no, God's not like that, and you're saying, yes, God's like that, you got to be talking about the same God. If you're talking about two different people, then your argument makes no sense, or two different beings. Then your argument makes no sense. So he says, if Islam and Christianity disagree only if they're referring to the same entities, predicating properties of the same subject, that term predicating properties is like senses, that kind of idea. And he says Islam and Christianity disagree. Therefore, Islam and Christianity are disagreeing about God, the same God. Now, again, this has some historical aspect. This isn't just modern arguments based on modern philosophy. When we look back and see how early Christians understood Islam, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see. One of the earliest Christian fathers who engaged with Islam, saw it, wrote about it, and taught others to be careful with it was John of Damascus. Now, he lived in the 7th and 8th century, so right when Islam is starting to peak. It's after Muhammad dies, but when the rightly guided caliphs start what they would consider Islam's golden age, and they start spreading across North Africa. They start coming up the Fertile Crescent. They start capturing things surrounding Constantinople, these kinds of things. And he's writing about these folks. And so he writes this actually rather large treatise called The Fountain of Knowledge, or The Fount of Knowledge. There's, however, Source of Knowledge is the way it actually reads in the Greek. He titled it using a Greek title. But in that massive book, there are three main sections, and one of the sections is on heresies. So he's going to explain all of the different heresies that he sees. And at the end of that, he talks about the heresies of the Ishmaelites. So again, those who descend from Ishmael, he's talking about the Muslims. And he does note these things. He writes specifically that Muhammad says, there is one God, creator of all things, who has neither been begotten nor has begotten. Surah 112 again. He says that the Christ is the word of God and his spirit, that the Christ is not the word of God and his spirit, but a creature and a servant, and that he was begotten without seed of Mary, the sister of Moses and Aaron. Now, he points to Surah 19:4 and 19 and Surah 4:169. Now, notice this. John of Damascus is pointing out some of these problems that I told you about in the Quran, where because Moses has a sister named Miriam and Jesus has a mother named Miriam, Muhammad conflates the two and thinks it's the same person. He doesn't realize, he's not really well studied in any of this stuff. So he mixes those two up. He does recognize that Jesus is born without a father. Isn't that interesting? He notices that Jesus has a virgin birth. But he's begotten without seed. But he thinks that the person the Mary who was birthed to him was the sister of Moses and Aaron. And he's just simply confusing that. John of Damascus continues the report saying, for, Muhammad says, he says, the Word and God and the Spirit entered into Mary, and she brought forth Jesus, who was a prophet and servant of God. And he says that the Jews wanted to crucify him in violation of the laws, and that they seized his shadow and crucified this, but Christ himself was not crucified. What John of Damascus is referring to there is the long-standing Muslim belief in the Quran that it wasn't Jesus on the cross, that it was someone who is made to appear like Jesus, sees his shadow. So this is actually a very interesting aside, where even in the 600s and the 700s, people understood that the crucifixion was so horrendous, was so barbaric, was so ignominious. It's so shameful that there could be no prophet of God who would have been crucified. That would just bring shame. That would be terrible. So therefore, Jesus couldn't have been crucified. It had to be someone who looks like him. Now, the Quran doesn't say who. Some Muslims believe that it was actually Judas that was put up on the cross in Jesus' stead because he was the one. There's all kinds of Muslim theories as to what this actually means, if it actually happened or not. But the Quran teaches that Jesus wasn't crucified. And John of Damascus has picked this up. And so he's noting that. He says, again, the Christ himself was not crucified, he says, nor did he die, for God, out of his love for him, took him to himself into heaven, which is Surah 4, 156. And he says this, that when the Christ had ascended into heaven, God asked him, O Jesus, did thou say I am the Son of God and God? And Jesus, he says, answered, quote, be merciful to me, Lord, thou knowest that I did not say this, and I did not scorn to be thy servant. But sinful men have written that I made this statement, and they have lied about me and fallen into error. And God answered and said to him, I know that thou didst not say this word. So here's John of Damascus giving some background information on Muslims. And what his position is Islam specifically is a heresy of Christianity. He's not saying it's a completely different faith. He's saying Islam came out of Christianity and went sideways, just as the Gnostics went sideways, just as the Nestorians went sideways, just as the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons today went sideways. But they are as heretics of Christianity, thus referring to the God of the Bible, because in order to be a heretic, you're still pointing back to the origin, to the person who's referenced in the original documents, and that therefore you're pointing back to God. So this is John of Damascus, and this is the argument that the Roman Catholics use. This is the argument that Doherty has used. He uses it, as I said, in two ways. One is the semantic argument, that reference points to the same being, even if many of those attributes are wrong. And secondly, because they disagree about who God is in the nature, as I've read with John of Damascus, then they have to be talking about the same person, and they have to be talking about the same being. Now, that's pretty much where the argument stands, and most people will go back and forth arguing about this. Is that enough? Does the fact that Muslims have taken the God of the Bible and twisted it to such a degree that it makes sense to say they're still talking about the same God? Now, I have some problems with this, first and foremost. I think that sometimes you start distorting things so much that the reference no longer applies. Yes, there is only one God. Yes, there is a creator God. But is that enough to do the full work of saying now the reference remains? Just as an aside, think of this idea. When you would go to Disneyland or you'd go to a theme park, they have these little machines. And I'm not sure if they use them anymore because most people don't have pennies in their pocket. But you could take a penny and you could take this, and this penny is legal tender, right? For all debts, public and private. That's the way we refer to it. And you could take this copper coin, this penny. You would be able to put this penny in the machine and it would press it out. And you would see it elongate. It would get flat. It would be a little concave or convex, and it would have usually a print of Disneyland on one side, that kind of thing. You have this little medallion, and you got to ask yourself, is this still a penny? I mean, it's still a thing that had its origin at the U.S. Mint, but it's no longer good for debts, public or private, is it? I mean, it's been distorted to the point of where it no longer refers to money anymore. It's something different. It's a keepsake now. It has fundamentally changed to the point of where it's something different. That's a lot of times where the argument starts to swirl. And I think that there's some legitimacy to that. I've written to that effect in the past. But that's not where I want to argue today. Here's where I think we can definitively say, I think points of reference and these arguments are interesting. Semantic arguments are important, but I think that they go wrong. And here's why I think they go wrong. Because all of them focus on this philosophical point of reference. But the question isn't simply about reference. What's the question? The question is, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And that means that we have to entail what the idea of worship means. Now, can we dismiss central aspects of how God has revealed himself to humanity as just sense and therefore secondary? I don't think so, as I've just alluded. But what does it mean to worship? What does it mean to worship? Nobody's talking about this. And this is why I wanted to build an argument. Because it's not the reference that does the work in this sentence. It's not that Muslims and Christians are both referring to God in some sense, way, shape, or form. And Muslims get it wrong. It's, do Muslims and Christians both worship? Remember the original objection of the professor at Wheaton College. She said that, as Pope Francis stated last week, we worship the same God. And as part of my Adventist worship, I will wear the hijab when working at Wheaton. And again, Vatican II, they profess to hold the faith of Abraham. And together with us, they adore the one, the merciful God, man's kind and judge. Do they? Do they adore the one? It seems to me that there's an assumption that worship is just simply something that we can do as we choose. And this is why I think this is really important. To think about this in terms of reference, I want to give you a biblical example. Let's look at Exodus chapter 32. This is a very famous biblical example, of course. While Moses is up for 40 days on Mount Sinai, receiving the 10 Commandments, receiving the instructions for temple worship, all of these things. It says in verse 1 of chapter 32 of Exodus that when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said unto him, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, good old Aaron, "Take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears, brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. Yes, the famous golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Now, what's the reference? The God who brings us out of the land of Egypt, right? That's who they're assuming this golden calf is or represents. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made the proclamation and said, quote, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And that is the holy name, the Yahweh name, the I am name. And so Aaron is referring to the same God as Moses preached. The reference is the same, correct? This is what we understand when we understand reference. "And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." Now, given this, if we stop here, it seems to me that the argument that Dougherty made, the argument that the Roman Catholic Church holds, would say they're talking about the same God. How does God understand this act? Well, luckily we don't have to wait very long, because in verse 7, the very next verse, we read it. "And the Lord said to Moses, Go down, for your people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it. He doesn't say they have worshipped me. They have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Doesn't seem like God is accepting that worship. It strikes me that what we're talking about here is worshiping God has to be more than simply pointing to a reference. And this is where I start my argument. This is how I build it. So I'm going to give you my argument, and I'll show it on the screen. I'll also put it below. This is, again, a deductive syllogism. It's an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion will follow naturally. Premise number one, Christians worship the one true God. And I think as any Bible-believing Christian, we would hold that to be true. If you don't believe that, if you believe you're worshiping a false God, then you're probably not a true Christian. And secondly, why in the world would you be doing that? Why would you believe that you're worshiping something that's not true? It doesn't make any sense to me. So in order to worship, I would think that you believe in the God of whom you worship. You hold to that. Okay, Christians worship the one true God. I'm going to state that as true because I'm arguing as a Christian. And Roman Catholics should state that to be true as well. I don't believe that Roman Catholics believe they're worshiping a false god. So we're starting right there. We know what the Muslims claim. Surah talks about it. But Muslims say that we had God first. We had the book first. And so we believe we're worshiping the true God. Okay, premise one. Premise two, worship by its nature has constraints. In other words, you can't worship by doing anything. Worship doesn't work like that. And in every society, even those who would worship the pagan deities, there were rules, there were structures in which you had to operate for that worship to be considered acceptable. You can't say, I am going to worship God in any old way I please. So let me unpack this with some premises. So people can worship many things in many ways, whether true or false, right? People can worship false things. People can worship true things. And different types of worship, that's 2.1. People can worship many things in many ways, whether true or false. 2.2, different types of worship will have different types of constraints. If you're worshiping Baal, you have to worship Baal in the way that the Baalites would worship. For example, if you're worshiping Molech, you have to burn your children in the fire. That's how he would accept worship. If you're worshiping an Aztec god, the rain god, you have to cut a live heart out of a human being and offer it up to him. You have to offer fruit to Buddhist deities. You have to, maybe throw a virgin into a volcano for Polynesian gods. Whatever the case is, there are certain constraints that apply in order for worship to be achieved. It's not ollie oxen free. You can't just, I'm going to go hit a bucket of balls and I'm going to call that worship. You're not worshiping God when you're doing that. I know a lot of people will use that excuse. I worship God by being in nature. No, you're not worshiping God. You're just walking around. Anyway, so people can worship many things in many ways, whether true or false. Different types of worship will have different types of constraint. However, 2.3, and this is the important aspect in all of this, all worship entails some type of submission to the thing worshipped. If you are claiming worship, you are claiming to put yourself below the thing that you are worshiping. There's some type of submissive act, submissive attitude, submissive stance that has to be approached. You can't worship something by lording it over and telling that thing, this is how it's going to be. I'm going to worship you because this is the way I say worship should be. That doesn't work. That's no longer worship. You've now misidentified and misdefined what worship is. Submission is in any aspect, whether you're talking about true gods, false gods, whatever way these priests have constructed, whatever way these gods have supposedly revealed, no matter what it is, you have to submit to them in order for it to be worshiped. You can't dictate to them what they should receive. Because once you dictate to them what they should be receiving, then you've put yourself above that deity. You're no longer worshiping it. So, all worship entails some type of submission to the thing worshipped. So I have Christians worship the one true God. Worship by its nature has constraints. And therefore, for worshiping the one true God to obtain, for it to actually happen, if you're going to actually worship the one true God, you must seek submission to that God. If we're talking about worshiping the one true God, the Christian God, then you have to seek to submit to the Christian God. And that means submitting to him what? Through obedience. Obedience, this is premise 4, obedience is a necessary part of submission. If you're not obeying what God said, you're not submitting to him. If you're not submitting to him, you're not worshiping him. Now, I break this down into 2 parts. If one intentionally rejects the requirements the one true God reveals for the worship of him, then one is not in submission to him. Notice my language is really specific here. I say if one intentionally rejects, if you knowingly say, I hear that, but no. But God says it's a requirement. But I hear that, but no. If you intentionally reject the requirements for the one true God reveals for worship, and you are not in submission to him. Therefore, if one intentionally rejects the requirement the one true God reveals for worship of him, one is not worshiping him. That seems pretty simple, right? So, point number 5. Muslims consciously, intentionally reject the requirements for worshiping the one true God. How do I know this? Because it's there, right there in the surahs. It's right there in John of Damascus when he says, God does not beget, nor does he begotten. Hey, what does John 3:16 tell us? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that those who believe in him shall not die, but have everlasting life. The reason why Surah 112 exists is to contradict John 3:16 and the Christian teaching. Its whole point is to say, I don't believe that. I'm not going to accept that. That's the whole point of Surah 112. And the Muslims call it shirk. And because the Muslims consider it the greatest of sins to do this, then we can't say that the Muslims are in submission to the Christian God, because they're standing in stark disobedience in the same way as the Israelites were standing in stark disobedience to the true God when they built the golden calf. It's the same idea. They weren't worshiping Yahweh when they were offering peace offerings and others offerings to the golden calf. No, they're offering it to it, not me, is what God says. He makes that clear distinction. Jesus, when he faces off against the Samaritan woman, if you remember in John chapter 4, she says, hey, we worship on this hill, you worship on that hill. He goes, you don't know what you worship. You're confused. We worship what we know. We have knowledge, but you are in defiance of that. So you're not actually, he doesn't say you're not actually worshiping, but he infers it by the fact that they're making the mistake. They're making the mistake. So my point is, if Muslims consciously reject the requirements for worshiping the one true God, then Muslims do not worship the one true God. And if Muslims don't worship the one true God, but Christians do worship the one true God, Muslims and Christians do not worship the same God. That's how the argument should play out. The idea of worship holds a whole lot of weight here. I hear no one talking about it. I hear a lot of people talking about aspects of, well, Muslims worship the one God, the creator God, but they do so in ignorance because they haven't been taught any better. And my response is, no, that's not true. They are taught. They are taught, first of all, you have a burden individually as a rational being to say, is what I believe reasonable? Is what I believe factual? I just don't accept everything that somebody's given me. I need to investigate it. Are there tension points within my worldview, within my belief system? You don't get a free ride because you were brought up as a Gnostic. You're still going to hell. It doesn't matter. You know, the Israelites, the Ten Commandments had not come down off the mountain yet. Okay? Moses had not yet brought them to the people, but God still held them accountable, saying, what are you doing behaving like the Egyptians? Creating golden calves like the Egyptians used to do. That's not who we are. And you should know better because you're thinking people. You should be checking this stuff out. And over again, we see biblically this is true. So one of the important scriptures that we can also look at is 1 John chapter 2, where John is talking about those who may be claiming to be Christians but truly aren't. And in verse 22 and 23, he says, who is the liar? Whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ, whoever denies the Father and the Son, this is the Antichrist. No one who denies the Son has the Father, but whoever confesses the Son has the Father as well. Now, this is pretty straightforward to me. This is pretty clear. You can't say that Muslims and Christians worship the same God when Muslims categorically deny the deity of Jesus. It's not that they don't know. It's not that they're fuzzy about it. It's that they say, absolutely not. Jesus was just a man. He was just a prophet. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus was a created being. They hold that they conflate him with Michael the Archangel and try to make that idea that God first created him and then created everybody else. But primarily, here's the fundamental aspect. You can't worship God and be in defiance of the revelation that God has given you for worship. And you have a responsibility, if you are going to be worshiping God, to humbly submit to him and check it out and say, wow, maybe I am wrong. Maybe I should check these things out. But there is none of that in Islam. Islam does not humble itself. It stands in defiance. It stands, as 1 John 2 says, one who denies the Son. And if you deny the Son, you deny the Father, which means that you are not worshiping God. You're standing in object defiance of God. You can't be worshiping the same God. It's the word worship, I think, that does the work here. And I think that is a powerful, powerful argument. So let me recap again. Christians worship the one true God. Worship by its nature has constraints. It always has. People can worship many things in many ways, whether true or false. And different types of worship have different types of constraints. However, all worship will entail some type of submission to that thing that they're worshiping. Therefore, worshiping the one true God, in order for that to happen, in order for it to obtain, one must seek submission to that God. And in order to submit, you must obey. Obedience is a necessary part of submission. If one intentionally rejects the requirements that the one true God reveals for worship of him, one is not in submission to him. Therefore, if one intentionally rejects the requirements the one true God reveals for worship, one is not worshiping him. Muslims consciously reject the requirements for worshiping the one true God because they reject the requirements that he puts forth. Again, 1 John 2:22. If you reject the Son, you reject the Father. Therefore, Muslims do not worship the one true God. And therefore, Muslims and Christians cannot worship the same God. Is this convincing? I hope so. Is this something new that you've not heard? I hope so too. I've worked a little bit on this argument. Would love to hear your thoughts. Please be free to share this, add to the debate. It's an interesting topic. I hope you've learned something. But in all of this, until next time, God bless. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.